To everyone. Alison, would you like to introduce the team formally, and then they'll let us know what we're going to do?
Yep. My mic on? No.
Oh, you've got to press the button. Yeah.
Ah, there it is.
Yep.
Now I'm online. Right. Let me just get my notes up for what I was actually going to say. So firstly, I wanted to really thank everyone for making the time to do this workshop. I don't know how you guys all feel, but the slide into Christmas is a little bit on the brutal side. And I've advised my team that they are all to relax and just slide in, that it's okay for us to feel tired and worn out at this time of year. So anyway, thank you for making the time. What I wanted to do in this hour is give you an update on the progress that we've made so far on evolving this concept and the process that we've been through. And I brought along the project team from PwC and Motif to help us do that. The lab represents an opportunity to leverage a small amount of council funding into significant impact, and it has been very well received as a concept by a variety of stakeholders, several of whom are keen to invest their time, money and resource into making the lab a success. So the purpose of the lab, which you may not remember from its small paragraph in the various Te Atakura documents, is to address that 36% gap that we have between what we forecast the reductions might be in the city and the reduction goal that we've set for the city. We know that we cannot achieve this alone, and we will need the active participation of Wellingtonians, especially the business sector, to get this done. So introducing the team, I've brought along Sylvia from PwC and James from Motif.
Awesome.
Turn on your microphone. Yep.
Kia ora koutou.
As well as in Pucheri, is it?
Yeah, Put and Marie.
Well, Pucheri.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui ki koutou, no te whanganui a tara ahau, kei PwC ahau e mahi ana, ko Sylvia Zur tako ingoa. So I am a Wellingtonian. I currently work at PwC, where I lead out the human-centred design practice and do a lot of the engagement and storytelling work. But previously, I spent about 10 years in the social enterprise, activist entrepreneurship space. It's where I bumped into our owner a few different times. Wellington City Council actually gave me the absolutely positively Wellingtonian something at some point in time. And yeah, I've done a bunch of work for the council, alongside the council, and also, I guess, within the context of climate change. Actually did one of the first climate change university papers up at Vic Uni, and helped bring the Climathon to Wellington from Europe, and also agitated and set up the Low Carbon Challenge, which turned into the Zero Carbon Challenge through the Inspiral Network. So it is, to be completely honest, phenomenal to be here right now talking about Climate Lab. It feels like it's one of those synchronicity threads, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation and letting you know the work that we've been doing. So thank you. And so Pucheri at the back has been looking after a lot of our content and hosting a lot of the sessions and workshops, and Marie, who will be capturing our conversation, are also part of my team and have been doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the background, and have also been holding a lot of the context through these conversations as well. Awesome.
Cool. Kia ora. I'm James Bushell. Pleasure to meet you all, and I've met a few of you. So yeah, it's just really cool to be in this room and have microphones. It's quite different. So yeah, I'm James Bushell. I suppose my main purpose in life is how do I create a more equitable and sustainable world, and so I do that through primarily investment and advisory. So I sit on the board of a number of different organisations, including businesses internationally and in New Zealand, a number of charities, as well as I am a research fellow at Victoria University and sit on their advisory board for ethics and sustainability, of which I've just finished a book on ethical leadership. Yeah, and so again, I suppose similar to Sylv, yeah, climate action has been something near and dear to my heart for a long time, and looking at that in a holistic way. So yeah, it's really privileged to be part of the team and presenting to you today.
And did you want to do an introduction round of who we all are?
Yep, and the two.
Yep. Marie, the lovely Marie, is there at the board. So she's at PwC, and Put, who you've met at the back, is also from PwC. Both awesome individuals. And around the table, because I don't know that you've met all of the councillors before.
Cool. Councillor Jenny Condi, out from Takapū Northern Ward. Don't think there's one.
Hi, I'm Sarah Free, Maura Kairangi Eastern, and I'm also Deputy Mayor.
Kia ora, I'm Fleur Fitzsimons, Paikawakawa Southern Ward Councillor.
Kia ora koutou, Timothy Paul, Pukehino Lambton Ward, City Councillor.
And I'm Sean Rush from the Eastern Ward.
Kia ora, Iona Pannett, Pukehino Lambton, Chair of the Puroro Amo Planning Environment Committee and Tam's the Deputy Chair. So obviously we have a deep interest in climate change. So it's great to see you all here.
Do we have any councillors
And
online?
yes, there are some people online, I think. Sorry, people, I can't see you, but I think there are a few. Jill, are you there?
Yep.
Oh,
Yeah,
Jill, do you want to introduce
okay.
yourself? Yep.
Yeah, I'm so called Jill Day Takuingoa. I'm a councillor for the Takapū Northern Ward. I'm wondering if Democracy Services are sharing the things a different way now, because I noticed that on the screens you can't see which councillors are there if they have their cameras on.
Kia ora, I'm here too. Councillor Rebecca Matthews, Whārangi Ward.
Hi.
Kia ora, thank you for that. Right, so we just want to make
Oh,
sure that you can
Iona.
see. Oh, Terry, sorry, Terry. Again,
And
sorry.
we've also got the mayor.
Thank you.
That's okay. Kia ora, Terry O'Neill, Tukawingoa for the Eastern
Thanks,
Suburbs.
Heidi.
Te Whatu Whārangi.
Kia ora, Andy Foster, Koromatua.
Hey,
Kia ora.
great. Thanks for putting aside the time. All right, we might kick into it. So this is that 36% gap that I was mentioning before, and I wanted to, I guess, put this little endeavour of Climate Lab into context. So all of those yellow reductions, they are investing in Let's Get Wellington Moving, investing in the bike network plan, achieving the 30% waste reduction target, achieving the Climate Change Commission's high scenario of electrification of the vehicle fleet, achieving a higher percentage of renewable electricity in the electricity grid. All of that investment and effort gets us a reduction of 21% in the city. So the gap between sort of what needs to happen in the city and what is currently, I would forecast, is quite significant. So there's several initiatives outlined in Te Atakura about how to get the city as a whole engaged and involved in this transformation that we need to undertake. And Climate Lab is just one of those initiatives about, as I said before, trying to leverage a small amount of money into a significant amount of impact and activity by others to get this done. Next slide.
Cool. So we've been on a bit of a discovery journey. Oh, that stays on. Cool. So initially we did a business case where we engaged a range of different stakeholders and businesses, really just to determine, is Climate Lab a good idea? From that we had an overwhelmingly positive response where, as Alison said, we had people offering a range of different resources, financial, space, expertise, in order to get this off the ground. And I'm sure many of you remember me talking to many of you, talking about it and saying how great an idea this was. From there, the climate emergency was declared, and budget was granted. Is that what we say? What's the technical?
Budget allocated in the LTP via the Te Atakura part of the consultation document. Yes, something like that.
Now I've got a political filter just to make sure I get these things right. And then so straight after that we started a design sprint. And so the idea of that was, you know, we'd sort of canvassed the community and then we really needed to determine what is it that Climate Lab's actually going to do. So that was a co-design process where we looked at what is the strategic direction and really delved into the strategic direction of what should Climate Lab do, what are the key interventions, barriers, We also looked at, we got PwC Global to do a global scan of the initiatives that are happening around the world as well as locally in New Zealand to make sure that whatever we're doing does fit into the broader ecosystem. After this stage, we're going to go into implementation planning, which is where we look at what are the next steps and how would we turn it from what are the initiatives and objectives to actually making it happen.
Awesome. So much of this update is now really focused on that design sprint component. The design sprint was, James in a moment will let you know who was involved with that, but specifically we aim to uncover two key things to really again test what do Wellingtonians think of this idea, how might it work, what could it look like, and secondly to really discover how could Climate Lab efficiently, effectively both leverage the opportunity but also support more climate action. As mentioned, we host a bunch of workshops, 4 specifically down at our space down at PwC, and the process that we kind of took folk through was firstly to align on that strategic direction and really agree on what's going to be the most efficient, effective ways to be able to cut carbon out of our economy. Secondly, we broadened the audience up to really understand what is stopping people from creating impact at scale, and we'll let you know a little bit more some of those key barriers soon. Thirdly, we then wove together the challenges, the people, the actions, what's going to work, what's not going to work, and then lastly started to really design and I guess more draft what could this look like in practice. So there are a bunch of thoughts that came through to that then can really start to feed into the implementation phase. But this sense check right now is kind of almost the crescendo of that to let you know what we heard and to make certain that we're getting the steer from you all too. In terms of the folk that we engaged with,
it's really, here's obviously a couple of logos of some of the people we engaged, but we're really keen to make sure we got a really broad representation of Wellington City. That began with mana whenua, so making sure we had representation from both Te Atiawa and Ngāti Toa, and again making sure that we set the workshops at times that were convenient for them. The whole thing we wanted to make sure was underpinned by data and by science. So we had a range of climate scientists, including ecologists and climate scientists, to ensure that A, we're focusing on the most up-to-date data, but also just to make sure that it was grounded in science and that our personal ambitions didn't get in the way. A range of organisations that are already in the space, Gen Zero, advocacy groups, central government, again looking at how do we fit within the ecosystem with the current changes that are going on at a central level, and large businesses and smaller social enterprises, again to understand what's worked in the past and also when they've been trying to achieve climate action, what have been the key barriers and what have been the things that have tripped them up along the way.
So we wanted to invite people who were from large businesses, small businesses, people who had done climate action before, people who had done startups, central government people who are working on the same challenge. So the MFE team that works on business partnerships came along, Wellington NZ, SBN, so trying to get anyone who has either been trying this before or has an opinion on this or has successfully done this before into the room to give us their brain space. And it was it's quite a generous community of people that they were able to give us their time, because this was 4 workshops that were 2 hours each, so plus kind of reviewing stuff in between. So it was really it was great that so many different people could be involved and lend us their brains and their input. It was great. Did you have any questions on sort of who we got involved or?
Just a question about, it says Te Atiawa, but whether we got Taranaki Whānui involved, since those are not the same groups, Te Atiawa and Taranaki Whānui?
I'm not sure.
Short answer is no. And then we'll explain the process going forward.
Yep.
Yeah, so thanks for that explanation, but I did wonder, there weren't many sort of groups from the energy sector there who they all have got expertise in this. I know First Gas are doing the biofuels, biogas, that sort of stuff. The Todd Group's got sustainability, solar, all that sort of thing. I'm just wondering, is that a next stage sort of on the journey, or because
it was kind of who, it was sort of who had the bandwidth to turn up. So BNZ and NZ Post both sent people, Centreport. In terms of the energy sector, I know a bit about sort of the challenges that are in that based on my Meridian background, but it was more to look at the how as opposed to the what. So, you know, their opinion on how do you do climate action and how do you get that moving faster, and what could council fund that would actually get that moving faster.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. Along with a little bit of the sort of what parts of the inventory are we going to focus on. Yeah, Tam, you had a question?
So was this which workshop was this of the 4? Was this I saw like at the beginning there was like the 4 workshops, like where does this one fit?
The
or
photo?
Was this all, no, so at the beginning there was like the drawing that had the 4 workshop maps.
Yeah, so the 4 workshops involved most of those people.
Oh, yeah.
We started with a core group of people.
Yeah.
So representing Mana Whenua and a couple of the larger organisations, and then we went out large.
Yeah.
So we invited like over 50 people to the second and third workshops, and then we came back small again to kind of go, what did we learn from that process and how would we narrow this information down into something concrete?
Cool.
So it was kind of, you know, a typical design sprint where you go back down the other side.
Cool. Thank you.
It comes with sound effects. Yeah. Any other questions before we move on? Next slide, put.
Awesome. So, what did we hear? A lot. I think, like Alison said, especially that second workshop, and I think that previous photo was from when there were about 50 people in the room. We broke them up into different groups and to really try and distill the conversations. But the key messages from what we heard, I wanted to share. Firstly, partnership is crucial in order for us to leverage this impact. I think there was a real acknowledgement that we can't do this alone. Secondly, Wellington has a unique bioregion, so we need to both learn, and thus we did the global scan, but also Wellington's, you know, what our inventory looks like, what our makeup looks like is quite unique, so we need to learn from nationally and globally, but also apply something specifically to Wellington. Thirdly, we need to address both the emissions that Wellingtonians create, but also what Wellingtonians buy. So that's really acknowledging that consumption is a significant part of our profile. We can't just limit and go, it's what we, the emissions that we create in our area. Investors are looking for strategic opportunities to create impact, and I think this was a real bridge over from the business case. But there's a lot of folk out there right now looking to figure out how do they support, how do they leverage, and they're wanting to know where does the strategy look like and who can help direct where that energy might go.
So it's kind of money sloshing around without a home.
Yeah.
Was kind of the feeling that we got, where they're kind of like a lot of enthusiasm to invest in climate action, but an uncertainty about what good climate action looks like or what the most impactful thing to spend that money on would be. So I guess the knowledge, there's a knowledge gap for investors in terms of where that impact will be the highest and what they should spend their money on.
Are they committed to climate justice? So, in other words, for those who are most vulnerable.
Yeah, we're getting to that part. Yeah.
I think in a moment we'll show what the key barriers are, which connects to what Alison was saying, and also the givens being the foundation that we need to build anything from. There needs to be a structure that's open and accessible and enables collaboration. I think part of that hesitation of not knowing where to invest is also it's not clear who's doing what, and there's a bit of a fear of doubling up. It's like, hang on, how does that fit? People say one thing, how do we make certain that's connected? I think everyone, including everyone in this room, agrees climate action is going too slow. You know, we've got a pretty limited time. How do we make certain that that can go faster? Climate action right now is not accessible and equitable for all, which potentially addresses what you're talking about. That was a pretty clear theme through it. We can't do one action at the cost of a separate one. So how do we hold that in balance? It is pretty difficult to navigate that ecosystem. It requires time, energy, sometimes a scientific background to know what to do. How do we help that? And lastly, and to be honest, this probably we did an update a couple of weeks ago with the stakeholder group. There's quite a bit of engagement fatigue out there. You know, people want us to commit to something. They don't want more conversations. They want to see that tangible action. Yeah. So I think that's a key consideration for moving forward as we start to move into the implementation, making certain that we've heard all the conversations, but we start to show true action moving forward. Should we move on to the key barriers? Do you want to cover this one?
Yeah. So the barriers that we heard, I mean, one of the frustrations and one of the key challenges that I laid down at the beginning of this design sprint was the solutions that are required are not particularly not known, right? It's not like we're all sitting around wondering what we should do. Like, there's a pretty good technical understanding of what's required. Whether that's understood by all the people who need to do it is, I think, the gap. So there's and one of the questions that I asked at the beginning of the workshops is, given that it's kind of understood what needs to happen, why isn't that happening? Why aren't we seeing climate action move at pace when it's clear that there's an emergency and there are some well-known solutions out there? Why isn't this occurring? Why isn't it going faster? And so we brainstormed over the course of these workshops what these barriers potentially are. So part of that is, from a business perspective, I think a lack of understanding and commitment to the fact that it's transformative change, not tweaking at the edges, and that's challenging business models, not just asking people to slightly reduce their emissions, but it might be asking them to completely change what business they're in. A need to maintain competitive advantage. I certainly felt that when I was at Meridian. There was a kind of, like, on the one hand, sure, I'd love to collaborate, but on the other hand, only if I get to hold on to all the IP, brand it as my company's activity only, and be the leader in this sector. So collaboration, but only to a point. And how do you translate the climate action that you know might need to happen into the BAU within your business? For investors, there was definitely a sort of, where do we put our money? And how do we make sure the allocation of resources is in the right place to the most effect, not duplicating effort by others, not duplicating effort by central government or by the Green Investment Fund? Like, how do we make sure we're having an impact that's cumulative and additional? And then thirdly, a bit of that disconnect between, I don't know what other people are doing and how can we come together to create sort of collective impact. And this piece I really like, the givens. Sylvia?
Yeah, awesome. So I guess that's quite a lot there. What we distilled it down to is what we've called our givens. You could call these principles, you could call these, to be frank, non-negotiables. Yeah, what needs to be true. That whatever intervention, whatever legal format, whatever it manifests in, this needs to be true. And you can start to see some of the patterns through there, right? That transformation. We're after transformation, not tweaks. The next 8 years is a priority. So as we start moving into the implementation, I guess the invitation there is to go, use this as your kind of stress test. What are those decisions? What are the sort of forks in the road? And how do we make certain that we honour this? So on a high level, no matter what, it has to be focused on carbon reduction. And it's not about net, it's actually about reducing overarching carbon in the Wellington region, but also, of course, not just seeing us as an isolated island, figuring out that within the wider context. I think the components of partnership on multiple levels, but also in terms of fulfilling our Te Tiriti obligations, is crucial. And we'll share at the end of this what we're doing to be able to further that into the next phase. And lastly, I think that focused on Wellington, but also making certain that it is accessible and equitable for all. There was I think it was in the second workshop where we were really starting to look at what are the interventions, how do we make certain that we could do this or we could do that, and that was that comment that I made around, you can't just say, hey, no more firewood burning if that comes at a social cost. So how do you make certain that there's climate action in all ways is both accessible and equitable for everyone? So that's kind of the core, the foundation, and I think that's the part that, and later on when we move into a bit more something where we want to get your specific feedback, hold that into account, because I think that gives you a little bit more context of where we move forward from here.
Next slide.
Next. I think it's inventory. Yes.
Yeah, and yeah.
You mentioned focus on reducing gross emissions, but isn't the structure of the Zero Carbon Act around net? Yeah. Isn't that
just-
the IPCC stuff, and we should be using offsets as if we can?
Yeah, so we went through quite a lot of discussion on this, and there aren't many opportunities for Wellington to increase the size of its forests. We don't have a lot of land. We don't have a lot of agriculture either. So our inventory is about half transport, about 40% building energy, and then smatterings of other things. So yes, that's the smattering, right? But that's the production inventory.
There's a lot of farmland out that's not productive, actually, out past Karori and south of Brooklyn.
Yeah, but in terms of how many carbon credits it can grow in the next 8 years, it's not enough. So if our focus is on trying to achieve that 2030 goal, we're not going to be able to plant our way out of it. Planting is still important, and we're still assessing all the council land that we own and the district planning settings and trying to encourage more forestry, but that's not going to get us where we need to go in the next 8 years.
It's part of the mix, though, I would have thought. That's
Okay,
Definitely,
how
but
much longer do
further.
you want to go for? Because I've got some questions. Like, is it? Yeah. Yeah, no, it's all right. Just
We've only got a couple of slides before we go back into questions.
okay, great. Okay, so
Yep.
you keep going, and then I'll put Tim and Fleur on. Cool.
This slide was about just that broader picture piece. So not only the social piece, we're trying to make sure that your solutions aren't harming more people than you're solving problems, but also from an environmental perspective that you're not causing more environmental harm with your solutions. So when looking for climate action, making sure that you're supporting the world that you're trying to bring into being, that you're not sort of scorching the earth on your way through, is always something to hold in the back of the mind. And so that's how that turns up as a given. Should we move on to interventions?
Yeah, I might say that just going back that one slide, to your
Go closer to the mic.
to your point, Sean, I think one of the things Climate Lab isn't going to solve the ecological and climate emergency. What we needed to determine is what is the most effective thing that Climate Lab as an entity can do. And so this sits, again, in a much broader ecosystem. Council is already doing a huge amount of other things, as well as a range of other organisations. So the focus is really what can Climate Lab do? And then again, that does fit into that broader ecosystem of the planetary boundaries, of IPCC, the greenhouse gas emission inventories, and then how do we actually support that with consumption as well as just the standard GHG protocol. So when we're looking at this, it's really designed to say the focus of Climate Lab is carbon reduction. When we're making sure that we're really pushing towards carbon reduction, how do we make sure that we're not having any unintended consequences in the broader ecosystem when it comes to biodiversity loss or ocean acidification or whatever the other planetary boundaries or wider ecosystem implications may be.
Yep, sure.
So
Yeah, sorry. I was looking at this, I was like, why isn't it changing? There
it's
we
up
go.
there.
We got, to Syl's point, a range of different initiatives that got put forward. In the end, we've cut that down to just 3 key initiatives. How this works is reach is down the bottom, so the wider it is, the broader the reach, but probably the less impact. And then as we go, it becomes the people that will be involved become a narrow audience, but the potential for transformational change becomes greater. And at the very top, it's really looking at a select few initiatives that we believe can have the greatest transformational change for Wellington City. So that's basically, it starts, the base layer is storytelling. Storytelling and narrative, and again, that is designed to reach the broadest audience possible. Where this differs, Alison will talk briefly about some of the work that they're already doing in this field. This is designed to actually be the voice of the city, so not necessarily just Wellington City Council's voice, but Ngāti Toa's voice. They're doing a huge amount of work in the sustainability space. We've got SBN, which is doing a huge amount. And so how do we actually share the stories of Wellington, of what is happening in the climate space, to try and join up the different dots? That then moves us into mapping, collaboration and insights. So one of the key challenges is duplication. Another key challenge is people actually not knowing what is going on within the city, as well as to find out it is just there is a reasonable amount of resource that just needs to happen to understand what is going on in the city. So this enables, and as Alison will tell, this is already about to get resourced. It's about mapping all the different projects that are going on, helping people find the different actions that they can do to have collective and collaborative action, and also to avoid duplication. When we get into the pipeline, again, and one of the reasons we think lab doesn't really encompass what we're trying to do is we're not trying to be experimental. We know that there are some, major carbon reducing activities, and so it's focusing on initiatives that have been very successful overseas that we can bring to Wellington to have impact, or initiatives that we know are going very well in Wellington and need the ability to scale. And that's where we have the ability to bring on additional investors and our, collaboration partners, which we have in the mapping and connections, to bring them on board to really scale up the initiatives that we think can have the most impact in the next eight and a half years.
So that's sort of like a matchmaking exercise between the money and the ideas, focused through the expertise of the lab on the stuff that's going to have the biggest impact. So that's sort of the intention of that. We'll call it something else, but because for me, lab is like incubating startups, and we still want to do that. So we're still going to fund the Climate Response Accelerator because it's such a good program, but those ideas won't bear fruit until the 30s and 40s. So we need them to do the other half of the net zero, but the next 8 years we need stuff that's already a really good idea. We need all the low-hanging fruit, all of the stuff at the lower end of the marginal abatement cost curve, all needs to just get done. Some of it incredibly boring, like replacing natural gas boilers in buildings in Wellington with heat pumps. Some of it is not sexy, but it just needs to bloody get done because it works and it creates impact, and why aren't people doing it? So, so it won't be called a lab anymore because I don't think that really reflects what it is. So it's something like a hub or a network, and we're going to sort of leave that open and let the group sort of, pull that together as a collective design exercise. But yeah, I'm quite excited by it. Having a new name, we'll see where that lands. Oh, look, we've had many ideas. One of my favourites was absolutely positively zero carbon, but I think it might be just too cheesy to be successful. But come on, it works. It works. I know. Brand recognition way high. But possibly too cheesy for words. This is probably a good point for us to pause for questions. I think there was a queue.
Yeah, it was Tam, Fleur and Sarah.
So cool. This is really awesome. So you reckon that we can hit that 36% chunk in 8 years with this? Do you reckon?
This won't be the only thing.
But a big part of that, 36%?
It'll be, it's like a necessary part of it. To be honest, I look at that 36% chunk and I'm intimidated by it because I'm like, how do we get from where we are now to there? How? So this is like one part of that, and what I like the most about it is that it's not one person sitting in council or one team in council going how. It's asking Wellingtonians to participate in the how. For me to go, let's make this a shared challenge and let's do this together, because it's not going to be one of us figuring that out on our own. It might not be the whole 36%, and it dovetails into the other work that my team is working on with the overall social marketing angle and the the conversation we want to have with Wellington about it's a climate emergency. Here's how, get on board, It's going to be fun. 8 years, halving emissions, party time, that kind of thing.
I'm looking forward to it. I've just got two other little
So it dovetails into that. Sorry.
Okay, cool. Then all good. That's really exciting. And so some of the things that you guys are describing in the slides, I kind of couldn't see why they couldn't be a part of council, like being able to connect up activities and communicate what we're doing and some of those kinds of things. So what's your kind of argument for this not just staying within council or being a part of like Wellington NZ or something like that?
So we've done initial thinking on how to set up the entity. But that's something that we're going to now spend a couple of months thinking about because we need advice from our internal legal team. Plus, we want to do this in partnership with Mana Whenua, so we want their input into how they would best like to, what they think that it looks like as well. So I don't want to kind of presuppose where that goes. One of the strong pieces of feedback, though, that we did get from people who offered us time, money, resource, spaces, was that they were not comfortable giving that money to council. So there's nothing to stop us from doing it ourselves, but we don't get additional funding to make it bigger. So we can still do the connections, we can still do the matchmaking, but we will be constrained in funding that effort with whatever money you allocate to us as councillors in LTPs and annual planning processes. If it becomes an entity separate, then you get to access other funding streams as well, where they have already told us they're not going to give their money to council to do that. The example that I would use for you to hold in your mind when you think about that is something like Predator-Free Wellington, where it's an entity that sits, it's not a council-controlled organisation, but we give them our support, and that entity also attracts support of others. It has a really clear, tight, defined purpose. It knows what it's doing. We all feel confident that it has that crystal clear kaupapa, and so we're trusting that that effort is doing what we want it to do. So it's, for me, it's not is it in or is it out, it's how big do we want it to be, and do we feel like we could define its kaupapa in such a crystal clear way that we feel confident with it being there as opposed to here. Either way, it can exist. So I'm kind of pushing on with starting it. I've got 2 roles that I'm recruiting for. One will do the kind of get about town, chat to everybody, find out who's in the herd, and channel funding grant applications into the Climate and Sustainability Fund process. And the other role is to pick up this idea and run with it, and just see what it turns into and what kind of enthusiasm we can actually get. Can we convert, success would look like, can we convert the expressions of interest? And, Victoria University, who are like, you could have it hosted with us. And I'm like, that's an idea, not so sure. And turning those expressions of interest into actual, dollars that they've handed us.
Okay.
Sorry,
we've only got till 2:30, so keep going. Yep.
I'm sorry, no, just the last one
Tam,
was
go.
pretty
I'll be
important.
faster
Pretty important.
answering.
How do you measure this? So will the impact be measured by council? Will it be measured by these people, or how will we measure?
Yeah.
And what will we measure?
We'll measure tonnes of carbon reduced in 8 years.
And council will do that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we will do that as part of either because we're requiring an entity to do it or because we're doing it, it just gets done.
Cool. Yeah,
Okay, thank you, Fleur.
Thanks so much for all the work. It's really interesting. I share the same concern around Tam about it being removed from council. So I was concerned about that before. I just think we shouldn't, as public entities, surrender the space, and actually we have a real legitimacy to be here. So I'm quite interested in the partnership with Victoria University. I think it's quite an interesting concept. The second thing is kind of related to that. One of the things I would like to see us take a more active role on is creating the rules that require reduction of emissions or the incentives. So what is it in our rating system, in our consenting processes, in the new changes coming in that we can actually mandate and require emission reduction or cut? And if it doesn't exist, but we want it to. What are we doing to make that happen? Because I'm sceptical about grants and behaviour change being enough. I want regulatory change. I want the rules to be different.
None of it's enough. The regulatory levers that we have to pull as council, so there's regulatory levers only central government can pull, and then there's some that we can. We can't require building owners to build higher than the building code. Extremely frustrating. So even though we deliver resource consents and building consents, in the building consent process, we can't ask for more. We do have a program of work about how we incentivise better buildings in Wellington regardless. And there's work we've done in the district plan looking at how we tweak settings to encourage better buildings. The key things that we have under our control that create significant carbon reduction is transport infrastructure and urban densification.
Yeah.
And we're pulling both of those levers, in my opinion, pretty much as hard as we can. Like, I don't know that, like, we could have gone harder in the district plan, but at the risk of civil war within Wellington, is how it felt. And on the transportation front, between Let's Get Wellington Moving, the bike network plan, the fossil-free central city notice of motion, the work by Gell and MR Cagney, like all of that work that's all of the stuff that council has power over as a road controlling authority and as the district plan owner. There's not a lot outside of that we can compel. So those are the levers that we pull.
I guess that's my question though. Like, have we done the work to see? Well, first of all, we've got to make sure those things happen. And I think, this work probably needs to help with that because we've made these decisions, but that doesn't mean that Wellington's accepted them and that they're enthusiastic about them and that they're going to roll out. Like, we're going to have to keep making the case and proving.
Yeah.
And I think that would be quite good to understand how to do that. But I guess I'm also not entirely sure that council has done that fine-tooth analysis of what we could be regulating and what it could, or what central government could. And I was a bit concerned. I liked the givens. I thought they were great. Except the focus just on Wellington. I just worry that there are some things that we could have influence over if we had a wider remit that might help us reduce emissions. And you talked about procurement, and that in terms of what we procure from other countries. But I just worry that it's too small.
I think it's this is within the context of the broader Te Atakura plan. So there are those pieces of work that are outlined in Te Atakura that cover off things like looking for where council is standing in the way of climate action or additional ways that council could enable climate action. So that's on our work plan as activities that my team undertakes. I think you're right about the sales pitch. You're definitely right about sustainable procurement. We did have a lot of discussion about how Wellington focused the lab needed to be, and we concluded that it was action within Wellington, action about what Wellingtonians purchase and bring in, because all of that causes emissions, and or any actions that we take that reduce emissions somewhere else, but it's a Wellington-based business or a Wellington-based organisation that's achieving that. There's also a piece of work in Te Atakura that's about central government advocacy, and we ruled that out as an activity for the lab to take because there's already that work being undertaken by my team within council. So our role as an advocate to central government.
Cool. And just my final question, I might have missed it. Sorry, I just had an emergency. But is the climate lab being outside council, that decision hasn't been made, eh? That'll be made here.
Yep.
Is it in May?
It'll be sometime next year. There's quite a lot of work to do to kind of figure out, like from a legal perspective, do you make it a CCO? Do you make it something like predator-free Wellington?
Yeah.
What are the pros and cons of those different options? And also being able to test them with potential partners in the lab to see which of those appeals to them the most, so that when we come back to you, you've got an understanding of the what the outcomes are that each different option gives, and that you can weigh up and make that decision. Yeah.
Okay, we've got 15 minutes, so we'll speed it up now. Sarah, Sean, and then I'll ask anyone online.
Sorry, I talked too much.
It's all good. No, it's all good. There's lots
Is there any way we can use the harbour, because I understand big carbon sink is the sea. Is there any way we can be doing more in the marine environment to absorb carbon?
Good idea.
There is some work being going on in kelp, so that's definitely so this work so far has been on how to design an entity or a set of interventions or effort that would then go, we need to be doing something with kelp in the harbour. But yes, I completely agree with you. There's lots of opportunities to do stuff in the harbour.
Is there also more we could do to encourage solar panels on people's houses?
There is. That is, if you're thinking though of a marginal abatement cost curve for what's your best bang for buck to reduce carbon, solar panels on rooftops is not it.
Okay.
It's large scale solar, large scale wind farms give you a better cost per tonne of carbon abated. Okay. But replacing a gas boiler with a heat pump in a building is a marvellous cost of per tonne abated.
I have a heat pump. I have no other heating, so I'm very good. The other thing is you mentioned one of the key principles was working in partnership with iwi.
Yep.
How do you imagine that's going to happen? Because we can't just demand that. So what do you...
No, we can't. So in terms of the next steps of what we're doing, can you throw up the next step slide? We've got, firstly, figuring out a new name for the thing. Secondly, formulating an iwi engagement plan. So I've got the Māori team within council meeting with PwC's Māori engagement team to work out how we're going to do that and what does it look like to develop a genuine relationship with Māori on this. I don't know what that looks like. I'm going to listen to the experts and let them tell me what that looks like, but that's definitely in the next phase. And then the third piece is just starting to get some of this stuff done. So starting to do it as we're investigating what future versions of this could look like.
My last question is, can we have an action list? Like, is there that we can do personally? Like, so, you know, what are there some simple things we could be doing? But I'm not asking for the answers now, but can we have a simple action list for councillors so we can be seen to lead?
Our 5-point action list is now on our external website. I've updated the entire website. So if you go there, it has all of the information you need and a 5-step list of stuff that you can do in your personal life.
Okay.
And I can also email you the councillor-specific list.
So where would
Happy to help. I can decarbonise you.
Yes, you can decarbonise me. I'm sure I'm very capable of being decarbonised. I'm getting a hybrid vehicle, actually.
I'll give you your own personal electric helicopter. It'll just pick you up and transport you wherever you need to go. It'll be fun.
I've got a few.
All right, okay.
Link to the website would be really good.
Cool.
Okay, cool. Sean?
Yeah, I've got a few questions, well, 2 or 3. So you talked about transformative change, and I was going to ask, what does this mean? But you then mentioned that you wouldn't, completely redo the district plan because that would go to war with Wellingtonians. So I'm sort of wondering, what does transformative change look like in this space? And the one reason why I ask is because I'm concerned that transformative change can actually result in poor outcomes for a whole range of different people, which may in fact be worse than the problem that we're trying to solve.
And that's really for the lab itself to solve. So that's a question for the people employed by the lab to grapple with and come to grips with in collaboration with the other people who are participating in the lab. So I don't pretend to have all of the answers to that. And I don't think anybody does, right? Like you've got concepts like donut economics, you've got all sorts of ideas out there. And that's why one of the givens is about achieving this in a accessible and just way, that you're not kind of... like, there's no point saving society if you've torn it to shreds to save society.
Correct.
Right? But at the same time, we have to halve emissions in 8 years' time.
Yeah.
That's like
we've got to do more than just no regrets, though, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
and perhaps
okay,
on a real practical level, for me personally, transformative change is there's a whole lot of activities around reusable cups, right? That is great. That needs to happen. But what is actually the system stuff that's driving that behaviour, and how would we make certain that we exactly?
It's full of carbon taken from the atmosphere. This will go into a landfill to be sequestered.
Done.
Oh.
But how do we make certain that that's changed on that level? And I think that's also the logic for that cone and the pyramid. So start with the storytelling and the narrative, then move to the mapping, and then figure out what are the transformative initiatives that would be supporting.
Okay, and you mentioned that you want to address emissions inbuilt into goods, and, which is fine. Isn't that an ETS issue, and how does the ETS feature into this, in the sense that as carbon prices, as they are, continue to increase, those types of goods with high carbon content will become more expensive, and that should do the job for us, so most economists say. So is that something we should really be focusing on?
In theory, the ETS achieves all things. In practice, I haven't seen that occur.
It's only been really, launched in the last 12 months, to be fair.
I mean, in theory, the government's national emissions reduction plan is going to solve all of our problems and achieve a massive reduction in carbon in 8 years. In practice, the national emissions reduction plan is not yet written, and what are the kinds of reductions that we're aiming for as a city.
Yeah. I mean, it goes to actually earlier question about the offsets, because
No, it's not. No, it's not your turn. It's not your turn.
We do have a practical exercise.
Okay, no,
that we
hang on.
wanted
No. It is actually getting too late, and we've got the strategic risk framework and then the district peer meeting. Can I just ask anyone online? Have you got any questions that you'd like to ask?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, Jill, go for it.
Kia ora. It's very interesting to listen to your kōrero about this. Interestingly, talking about what councillors can do, I noticed yesterday that Auckland City councillors have free public transport access, and I reckon that's something we should be considering over car parks, but I don't know how that works. My question was around the community connection, because I know with a lot of the stuff, the most challenging aspect is the behaviour change. And I guess just how this kaupapa will be really closely connected with community, so that everything that's happening is thinking about how community is supporting and coming along on that journey.
Yeah, this is a more business-focused initiative. I am also doing work in the team on how we connect with communities better and what that looks like. I'm flirting with ideas around community forums or community-led sort of climate action design spaces, but it's really, I haven't come to any firm ideas on that, Jill, so if you've got any ideas, feel free to send them through.
I guess even with it being business focused, though, in some ways the community still, we want that to be really strong, even through whatever businesses, people are thinking and how they are, I guess, engaging, and just, it really, we know that even though everybody feels completely helpless and feels like their little bit doesn't make a difference, that needs to always be a really strong message, because otherwise it's just always someone else's solution, and feels like it does still need to fit quite closely.
Yep, thank you.
Cool. Rebecca, Terry, Andy, anything?
Yes, so mine is just related to what Jill was saying, and I just wanted to put in a little plea for our community-initiated campaign in Niah and Crofton Downs, because that has come from the community, and they have, I guess, several times tried to reach out to council about how to work, to get support to do something. And, I think they still haven't really had that need met. They're doing stuff like monthly recycling of electronics and things like that, but they really are sort of seeking guidance on how to kind of get things moving in our community.
Good idea. Can I just quickly, yes, then Laurie, can I just, no.
I've got my hand up too, Iona.
Oh, sorry, Terry, you go. No, you've already had a go. So Terry?
Yeah, that was just around working in with community initiatives and groups, because our little schools try so hard to change things, or businesses in Kilburnie, similar to what Rebecca's mentioned, or Kai Cycle, and just really making sure that it doesn't become a super, Wellington Central centric looking plan, because then that's really hard to kind of engage with in terms of community, to be able to show that this is their place, but taking in all the awesome work that's done.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks. Andy, anything? Just quickly, James, can I pick up on something you said? Sure. My concern is that, look, this is great, but we're not actually delving deeply enough into the problem, which is around our relationship with nature, around our relationship with ourselves, all the rest of it. And when you get business in, there can be a little bit of a problem with a lot of green capitalism. So I guess, where is that space that we can have that conversation? That might be a question for offline, but I'm just raising it now. Laurie, and then Tam, and then so we've got a strategic risk discussion, and that would be appropriate to talk about climate change there.
It's just.
And maybe it's more that our space now as councillors is a bit more community facing than business facing, having bridged both of those spaces or experienced them. But I can see this rise in community wanting to activate their local community to take leadership, and that's really rising as a big opportunity. So just to back that up, that's the third, just saying that that's a real rise that I'm seeing.
Cool, awesome. Thank you.
Tam. You're desperate.
Oh no, these are just my. Since everyone's just doing their final important points, I think it would be cool to see a bit more detail about the te tiriti stuff as non-negotiable and just seeing what that means, because I think these engagement plans are just sprinkled everywhere throughout the public and private sector, and they don't really equate to any tino rangatira for iwi. Or sometimes. And the other thing is, I think that focus on the just transition is really important to me, given it's public funding that we're contributing. I want to see why this would be better than just giving free public transport to people. Than why would this be better and more impactful than giving direct or transitioning our public housing to be energy neutral. I want to know why this is a better use of public funds than. But that's what I want to see. I don't want the answers now. Just something I'd like to see.
You need to stay in the place of and. So it's not that this is at the expense of something else. It's that we need all of the pieces of the puzzle to be pulled at the same time, and we need all of them to be pursued as hard and as fast as we possibly can. So I guess the question is, if you don't want me to engage with business in Wellington, that's fine, but that 36% will stay there. So it's what is the best way for council as an organisation that I don't think has a terribly fantastic relationship with business. How do we motivate, inspire and engage with business to be doing their part of the puzzle in this?
Okay, great. Look, I'm sorry, but that was only a very brief hour. Thank you so much to the team from PwC Motif. Thank you so much. And obviously you've got a lot of enthusiasm here, and we can do some more stuff. So maybe have another workshop at some point in the early new year. Thank you. Have a great break.
Thank you.
Right, we're going to talk about strategic risk. I want to talk about climate change and earthquakes. Let's go.
We don't want to give it away to anybody else.
Chair, is this on the same Zoom link?
That is a good question. Hayley, it is the same Zoom link. Thank you. Look forward to your thoughts. Thank you. Right, I'm going to get out of the way.
Welcome to our crazy.
We can.
Right, good. Yeah. Right, well, I'm glad you came in on the. I'm going to take climate change fire, so this organisation needs to look
get one or two people actually online, but I think for the sake of the afternoon and your workload, we should get going. Thanks, Sarah. Can I just say, firstly, it is great to see you guys for the first time, really, in reality. It's been a case where, obviously, since my appointment, we've all been generally by way of Zoom, so it's wonderful to actually catch up with you folk on a good Wellington day. Look, I would like to just make a couple of very quick opening comments before I throw it over to Stephen, Kim and Richard. This is actually for me quite exciting because I got asked to come in and look through things, and this is really a sign of us getting the right building blocks in place for the work of the subcommittee. Actually, dare I say it, for the course of the next 3 years. I'm making some assumption that post the elections you agree to still have a subcommittee, by the way. That could be presumptuous on my part. But the cornerstone of the work of a risk committee is clearly what are the big risks. And so the first thing we want to deal with this afternoon is really information sharing about actually what are the big risks that have been worked through with you folk, and how they sit, and how the team wish to report those risks to us at our subcommittee. So there's some real questions. Are these the right risks? Number one. Number two, is the information that will come to us sufficient for us to be able to, as governors, govern risk? So that's good. The second part of the afternoon is a short item from Richard, just indicating how actually at the committee we intend to deal with risk management. So, and that, might I say, is part of a larger 3-year work program that we have developed up. And as I said, I think is actually quite exciting. So look, it's very much getting us into the realms of really hitting our straps next year when we meet as a risk committee. But to do that, this is a good chance to share what we intend on doing, number one, and number two, making certain that you understand what we would do at the committee. Can I just stress a couple of other things? While I should know the number. How many risks have we got here, Kim? While there are 13, okay, while there are 13, today's not the day. Today is not the day to debate why we have those 13, because in fact that's the work of the risk committee. And so when we deal with Richard's work on how we plan to look at these risks, we'll explain how we plan to deal with those at the committee. So we're not debating the risks directly. We don't have time today for 13. The other thing I just want to reflect here is that one of the early comments I received was what was the role of our subcommittee versus the other committees of council. So for instance, as your independent chair, I'm very worried about capital delivery. But actually that's also covered by another committee. Okay, but I want to reflect that from our perspective, we are looking this from a higher level risk perspective as being one of the big risks that we face. How does that fit within our scheme? Have we got the right resources? As in contrast to what that program is, what are the political and policy choices that you would have around it? That is nothing to do with the subcommittee. So there are a number of places, health and safety, even the annual report, I've had questions over why do we deal with this, and there's also a finance and performance committee. So we're not going to debate that directly today, but I have got in place some meetings where I'll talk with one or two committee chairs just to make certain that we are aligned. I think the other thing that I'd just like to note here is that as a subcommittee, we need to recognise that we're doing this for the rest of your colleagues, all councillors. And it's one of the great debates, no, it wasn't a great debate, I suppose, but it's one of the debates within the sector. Should these be committees as a whole or a subcommittee? And a subcommittee is absolutely fine, as long as those of you that are on the committee are champions amongst your colleagues for actually our work. Because if we are managing these, governing these 13 top risks, it's really important the rest of your colleagues know. I would be very open as we go through the course of the new year to talk about how do we share the work that we do with the rest of your colleagues. Because probably implicitly they are taking confidence from what we do. That's good. It should be that way, but actually it shouldn't be blind confidence. And I think you might recognise that as we look at the work program, what we intend on doing, it's a sort of subcommittee where all councillors would be incredibly welcome as we look at the broader risks. So for those of you that are actually directly unappointed, well done for being here, but actually there may well be, as we go through at times when we want to encourage that openness of everybody being here. So very exciting time, 13 big risks, and actually what we're going to do about it with inside the committee as we start our work next year. So Stephen, thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I just wanted to make a couple of comments in terms of scene sets. Obviously, this refreshed framework naturally follows on from the adoption of the LTP, and the timing's just perfect for that. And I guess our focus has been on what could threaten the achievement of our strategic objectives and priorities. Obviously, as set out in the LTP, there's a lot of work that's gone into developing up what you'll see this afternoon. Since your last workshop, ELT has definitely owned this process and has been obviously involved deeply in the fleshing out of the risk profiles, which will just kind of give you a sample of that this afternoon, but that will definitely come through in terms of the work of the Audit and Risk Committee. We today are looking for feedback on the framework itself, and we've got some specific questions which were pre-circulated. As Bruce said, we don't really intend to deep dive into those 13 today, but that will really, I guess, drive the work of this subcommittee, but also the principal committees that the council has in place. And just by way of example, you will be familiar with our format of our reports that come through to council. There's a risk section in each of them, and we would expect that as these topics or issues are coming up through the committees for decision, that there's an expansion of or a reference to those risks. The framework will enable the work of this committee and obviously inform the other committees. Following any feedback that we get today, we will implement that framework, and you'll see it come through in the February round of the Audit and Risk Subcommittee and other committees in the new year. And I guess, we're really wanting to get going on it and kind of learn by doing, as opposed to, kind of going around on the same spot with it. We think we should, based on the feedback today, just kind of implement it and get on with it and try it and adapt as we go along. So that's kind of what we were looking for today. So I'll hand over to Kim and she'll take you through. There's not very many slides. We really want the conversation.
Thank you, Stephen. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Kim Wright taku ingoa. Welcome to this overview of where we're up to with our strategic risks work. I'd like to set some of you may have been present when we had the online session in August, maybe not all of you, so there's a little bit of context setting at the start as well, but Stephen has also introduced. So for the strategic risks, what we're really thinking about is all risk is in context of what are our objectives. So if we're talking about adhering to international standards, thinking about what are we trying to achieve as an organisation is always the fundamental question, and what are those big kind of showstoppers or challenges or threats that could actually get in our way. So for us, we have, as Stephen referred to, the LTP, outcomes and objectives, some priority areas, but also just everyday functioning as an organisation, making sure we can continue to do our work every day, delivering all the services we do. So strategic risks do cover some of those big long-term goals and outcomes, but it's also actually what could stop us from just doing our work as a council and being there for the people of Wellington. So we think about things like our vision and our priorities, but also just about that being an organisation that's actually fit for purpose, has the people to do it, has the budget to do our work. So that's our context for the strategic risk framework. We did refresh the approach, and that was really to think about more what it means to be a council, not just a corporate entity with legal and reputational and financial risks, but actually how can we capture more and talk about the services that we deliver, the things we have that are unique to our council that help us to do our work. So maybe our really specific softwares or tools that help us to do our work. So what are the things we need to actually continue to achieve our objectives, and what are the threats to those? So we expanded our list of the consequences we look at to think about this is what it means for a council, and these are the threats we face. The process is to actually look at these list of 13 threats, and then for each of them think about the risks associated with them. So for each of these we have developed these living documents, these risk profiles that provide that overview of what are the risks associated with this threat, what are we doing about it as a council, what would happen if, in the worst case scenario, this threat would actually, if we don't manage it well, and what will happen if we do manage it, or what activities and actions can we do to change this risk. So that's where the risk profiles describe what we can do about these risks, what we will do about the risks, and maybe some other gaps and opportunities. But also, as Stephen said, thinking about a lot of that management is happening across the council and being reported to other committees. So where is that other information about how the risk's being managed, being captured, and how can we reflect that and report it to you as governors? So that's that connection from this committee to the other committees and the other papers, and it goes both ways. So we're trying to represent to you the reporting that's going to the other committees to say, this is where you will find more information on this specific project or program that is helping with this risk. But likewise, when people are putting up their papers to other committees, we would expect them to be referencing back to the strategic risk, saying this is actually on our strategic risk register, and the work we're doing will have some impact on that risk. So that's the connection we're trying to build. And then the other opportunity that we're hoping that you will find from the artefacts that we're showing you today is actually having a much more in-depth discussion about areas that you have as priority or focus area to test that governance, to say, well, what are the experts across the council, what is our role, what are the priorities or focus areas from these strategic risks that we can have a much more in-depth discussion about. We had, a shorter form version of that one when we talked about the cyber threat risk prior to the lockdown. So when we kicked off, how do we come up with our 13? We looked at the big kind of shocks and stresses that are external to us that could impact our council and our city, which is our operating environment, our people, and the people of Wellington. And we also looked at what are the internal challenges that we face as a council that it could actually hamper us in our delivery or our everyday work. So we came up with that list of 13, and part of them were risks we already had on our strategic risk register. Some were ones that other councils are using, and others were gleaned from our Tier 3, Tier 4 ELT managers. So what are the things that they're thinking about as our threats? So that's where our list of 13 came. I didn't realise till today that it was an unlucky number, but thanks for that. So when we think about these threats, we look at them in the context of these are the challenges for our councils, and obviously some of them are big external things. And when we think about the management of our risks and what we're describing, it's how much influence do we have over those risks and what we can actually do as a council to play our part in managing the risk. For the internal ones, obviously that's very much in our camp. We should be doing what we can because it's our risks. For the external ones, we do what we can to actually lessen the risk within our influence. So here's that list of 13 threats. You would have seen it in August. Nothing has changed from that. So I won't dwell on these too much, except to say we have a risk profile for each of these. We have an assessment, that's the maximum credible event scenario that we use to say, what is the worst case we might face with this? What does this mean for us as a council? Bearing in mind that the actions and activities we want to do is actually to alleviate that worst case scenario. But if you don't plan for or understand the worst, you can't really manage the smaller events as well. So for each of those, we've looked at, what are the big things that could happen, and then thinking about that, what actions and activities are going on across the council, and where will that bring our risk to? So what's our target or our goal risk once we've done the work? What difference can we actually make? Can we change the likelihood? Can we change the consequences? So that's what we've got for each of these threats, using that kind of long list of consequences we now think about. So I just want to talk now about the artefacts that we'd like to bring to you for reporting to actually help steer your conversation about risk and the role of this committee. So what we want to do is bring to you a summary dashboard as well as the 13 risk profiles. So that's quite a lot of paperwork. We wouldn't expect the risk profiles to change substantially meeting to meeting, but where they do change, we'd certainly be flagging any significant changes in the risk or risk management and any changes or emerging risks. But the dashboard is really to summarise across the 13 to say, this is where we assess them, this is our target, this is any new information since we last reported to you that shows a change in the risk or anything emerging. So if you just look at the table and the heat map, they're both showing the same information essentially in different ways. So the black dots are kind of where we've assessed those worst case scenarios, and the sort of bluey grey dots are saying if we get all this work in place that we have planned and in progress, this is where we expect these risks to fall once we've done the work, and that's based on sometimes a change in likelihood and sometimes a change in the overall consequences. Here's a more detailed look at how the assessments were developed. So this was done with ELT and subject matter experts. So for our 13 threats across the top, if you look down the columns, you can see the individual assessments and the consequences they were assessed against. And then if you look across the page, you can also look at some of those kind of key priority or focus areas that we might want to take a look at if we're just looking at specific consequences. So if we wanted to have an in-depth conversation about the various threats to staff, health and safety and well-being, we can look there. There's a range of threats that might threaten there. Or we might look at specific measures that we're taking, say, for earthquake and tsunami. So what are the things in place we have to actually manage that threat. So the idea of this visualisation is we can look across or we can look down to say what is driving the risk and what can we actually do about it as a council, what's within our power, and what can we do. So the commentary bit there is where we'd really flag any kind of key changes or saying this has happened and it's actually made a difference to the risk. So it's really about having some evidence to say if we did this work, would it actually make a material difference to the risk? These are really big deals. They are big strategic risks. We wouldn't expect them to shift that quickly. So we want to just indicate where something has actually made a change. And also if there's new risks or emerging situations, we can note them on here as well. So here's a snapshot of what you'd expect to see in each of the 13 risk profiles. And so this is what I'm showing you today and asking you today is this the right kind of information? Is this enough information to start that conversation about the risks and for you to know which committees will be having information about these risks? What kind of questions could you ask your colleagues who are attending those other committees? How will I know this risk is being managed? So what's my role as a governor? Does this provide me with that information that we have in place, the structures to identify and manage our risks? So the profile captures quite a lot of information around the assessment that we did, and there's some rationale there about why we assessed the risk as we did. That's in that kind of number one area. And then we've got some information about the risk management. That's really around number 3. And then those gaps and opportunities. And also we're expecting number 6, the links to key papers to other committees to be expanding over time, and that will be a source where people who don't get to attend the committee, such as our independent members, can link to those committees and say, hey, here's a really key paper that was about how we were going to manage these resource and supply constraints, for example. So that's the artefacts that we're planning to bring the whole suite of them to you in February for your discussion. What we have now is these questions, but before we kick into those for discussion, Rich is going to cover the forward work program, which shows the opportunities for actually where you might want to have those in-depth discussions about the risk and how you might want to prioritise those discussions.
Just before Richard does that, back on one of the other slides where we did the analysis, Kim mentioned it, but it's worth just elaborating briefly on it. The supply in resourcing risk, the count, and where we assessed it was almost certain. Well, in fact, it's moved since then in a positive way because the council has rescheduled the capital program, which has, dropped down the likelihood of that particular risk. And so I guess it's, these are point in time kind of assessments, and the more important thing is having the conversation through the Audit and Risk Committee rather than necessarily getting absolutely tied up in the, where these things have actually been assessed at, because that's like it's sort of a subjective assessment that we do. Now, some of it's informed with evidence-based, but, somebody else that looked at it might have a different perspective. So I wouldn't get too tied up in the absolute nature of where these risks have been actually assessed at, because they will change in time, and one of them, has already changed. But it's to enable the right conversations to be had. So I'd just make that point.
So, yeah, I just wanted to know, because we looked at those 13 risks and they were very, very general statements. And then suddenly we saw a specific risk, which was around supply chains and resources. What's the transition? How does that very specific example slot back into the very general framework of 13 risks? Because I seem to, in my mind, have missed a step.
Sure. So for each of these 13, what we have developed and what we will bring to you in February is a document like this for each of the 13. So we have done the risk assessment for each of those 13 risks, and we'll also bring to you the summary table. Yeah. Sorry, that. Yeah.
Sorry, Sarah, if we can just go back to the slide that says emerging risks. So here goes an important part for the committee.
Oh, you got your mic.
Sorry? It's on? It's on? Am I not? It's on? Okay, I'll put it that way. It's directional. Okay, there we go. An important part here is, okay, so we settle on the 13. We start with that. Steve's already mentioned that one of them's moved. They will move over time, although I think, Kim, you said quite naturally some of those will always be with us as long as we're sitting here around the council table. That's fine, but they could change in nature. Emerging risks, Sarah, is actually the point I wanted to bring here, is that I would be very surprised that at each quarterly risk meeting we don't have emergent risk as well. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's necessarily something that will supplant or change the 13, but it may be something that we need to emphasise. The other thing is that when you have such high-level stated risks, there are probably, and we've got to be careful how we float the word risk all over the place, there will be contributing or subsidiary risks. And in a deep dive, in other words, the work of the committee may well start thinking of some of the other risks that contribute to these high-level risks. It's a very natural thing to go to. The example being service delivery. I was at, and I'll name it, Waipa last Monday. And our big question was service delivery risk. Well, that got us into the organisational risks of recruitment and retention of staff, staff salaries, supply chain, and all that sort of stuff. And so that's the nature of the richness of the discussion you actually have at the committee to be able to better characterise the risk. So that I'm not saying that we shouldn't be careful about the nature of the discussion we have at a committee, but it will be wide-ranging once you get into the deep dive.
Thanks, Bruce. Kia ora, councillors. Nice to see you in person. This is a snapshot or an extract from a much bigger forward work programme, and it's built around each of the elements in the subcommittee's terms of reference, which I'm sure you know by heart are internal and external audit, CCO's health and safety, LTP, legal risk and statutory reporting. So we have a table like this for each of those elements. But I think the big change to point out to you from those that were familiar with our previous risk framework and reporting is the chief officers that will be coming to talk to the subcommittee. And that will be the opportunity to dive into some of the 13 risks, the emerging risks, to question the officers themselves. So it'll bring the risk discussion to life, which is really what risk management, the big benefit. In June 2022, you'll see on there, there's an opportunity to refresh the 13 risks. We don't anticipate that's going to be a wholesale start to fresh, but if there's any emerging, and it's also an opportunity to tweak the framework, because we'll have had a couple of meetings by that stage to see are there any changes we want to the reporting that's coming to the subcommittee. And to recalibrate possibly some of the ratings of the existing risks. Hopefully some will have moved by then, but as we acknowledge, some won't. And then just to state again what everybody else has said, so the other committees will be receiving risk-related reports. They'll also be responsible for managing the challenges posed by these risks. They'll be receiving tracking the KPIs that are relevant to the long-term risks themselves, and all of that information, there'll be flows in both directions which will reflect. Kim will be doing a lot of tracking of these 13 risks over time. So the intention with this forward work programme, the full forward work programme will come to the February Audit and Risk Subcommittee to be endorsed for approval. Thank you.
I wonder, Richard, if I could just add a couple of comments there. This is a wee bit of change from what I'm bringing to the committee's life. This has been my request to Barbara, that we actually get the GMs in here and we talk with them. I talked to, for those of you that can remember, an original or initial an initial meeting with me by way of Zoom soon after my appointment. I reflected that the role of the committee is clearly, in terms of its governance of risk, is access to staff and the ability to talk and raise questions. As long as we stay within topic, as long as we ask questions, and I think in a supportive and solution-focused way. But we do have a level of holding management to account. You can't do it if you don't see management. And firstly, I just want to acknowledge Barbara. I said, Barbara, I'd be very keen that we must have you speak to us at every meeting. And she's committed to that. You can see that in terms of that. But it's also relevant that the GMs roll through the meeting. And broadly speaking, I'd be expecting them to talk and relate to us what are the risks, particularly the big risks they own. But I'd be encouraging them to be open with us as long as we respect that, play the ball, not the man. I'd be very keen that we hear from them about what's literally keeping them awake at night. Because again, we're going to start understanding what is the real risk dynamic inside the organisation, what can we do to help about that, and what is management doing to manage that. So it tends to be a very rich conversation, but it also is not something that you can have all in one meeting. Hence, you'll see that we've mapped it out. I have challenged Steve here to say, why are you last on that list? But anyway, he's the man that writes the report is the one that controls the records. So that's not a problem. He's with us with every meeting, so I'm not going to let him off. I'm not going to let him off the hook.
You'll be pleased to know I'm second last.
My point is here's a chance for us to have not only periodically a deep dive, not periodically, but a deep dive in those risks, but we actually have risk owners with us as well, which Kim, I think you mentioned right at the start, was important. Now, Heidi, thank you. Roy has got a question. Roy, welcome, Roy. Good to see you here, mate.
See you. All I can see is the back of your head, but it looks good. I had a question about the 13 risk profiles we've gone past that that slide, and I don't know if you wanted an because I can't see infrastructure failure on that list of risks anywhere. Got to be dealt with somewhere else, or maybe it's tied up the number of those risks in some way. But infrastructure, to me, is we end with that at the next meeting, Bruce.
Can we go back to the 13, please?
Yeah, no, that isn't on there as a discrete threat, but that doesn't mean we couldn't add it in the future. How we're capturing the impacts on our infrastructure is actually in a couple of ways. One is the critical assets we own as a consequence. So what are these threats going to do to our critical assets, such as our pipe networks or our other physical structures, but also what does that mean for the services the infrastructure provides, because we are a service provider to provide roads, water, etc. So that is how that captured as a consequence to the community for the services they provide, rather than as a threat to the council. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at it from that other lens if you think that would be a helpful driver of a risk conversation.
It would also be captured in terms of inadequate planning and prioritisation in terms of investment, which is kind of the angle that we've taken through the LTP, addressing the problem with improved planning and prioritisation and investment. So it depends which angle you really want to take.
Yes, whether it's or a risk or the consequence of something going wrong. Yeah,
it can be both. That's
I'll leave that
that's the challenge of that one. Yeah,
it is. I'll leave you to think about that.
Roy, that's the richness of having an established start. And the fact that actually through the course of our conversation we are able, I'm open to us change it in the way that Kim is suggesting that we will be. And if it doesn't make sense to us that we're not talking about the right risks, hence we will have a discussion about whether we have got our profile right. And it also means that actually the profiling is not a once in a blue moon event. It's certainly going to happen annually under my watch. So we've got a chance to change things as well.
Are we doing questions now?
Thank you.
Are we doing questions?
You go first.
Yeah, I got a couple. So as a former in-house lawyer, I would annually present to the Audit and Finance Committee about litigation risks and legal risk, and so I'm wondering why the General Counsel wasn't going to provide a similar report.
Can we please keep those 13 risks up in front of us, because I'm not comfortable either with them.
Perhaps if I can answer your question, Sean, the General Legal Counsel, we're programming that in as a every meeting that they would provide a direct update rather than at this level, because legal risk is part of all of those to some extent. So she will attend that meeting and give a verbal update about anything that's kind of active at that point in time.
Okay, and just I guess I'm looking at the inadequate response to climate change bullet there that presupposes there's an adequate response. I mean, we need to own up to the fact that no matter what we do in Wellington, it won't make any difference to the weather going forward, but there's a do your part kind of response, which is that reputation? Yeah, and that adaptation, yeah. But this I think it talks more about mitigation, actually. But I'm just sort of wondering, the weather will be what it will be in terms of that, and so are we talking about adaptation here?
What we're talking about is we have the Te Atakura plan, and this is our role as a council in responding to the climate change challenges, which is both adaptation and mitigation. And we've set out these are the things we will do to respond to the climate change threat, which part of it is around what can we do as a council to mitigate and support others to mitigate, but also what influence do we have over adaptation. And as without getting into a deep dive, as we've talked about, we have quite a substantial role in, say, land use planning and other things that actually do help the city to adapt. So it's actually saying we've made a commitment to this. It's a big threat facing our city. So what happens if we don't? And so there are probably reputational and partnership as well as environmental and community risks around that if we do fail to respond.
I'd just add to that, Bruce said earlier in the meeting that the subcommittee isn't really focused on the policy response. That's actually sitting with Iona's committee, and our reference point would be those established policies and legislative requirements, all those sorts of things, so that what this committee would be doing is saying, are we on track to implement or honour the commitments that are being made?
Sure.
Yeah.
But that's the same as any part of the LTP or other policy as well, though, right? I mean, if we don't deliver a capital plan, we won't execute the projects we want. Same token, we'll probably save quite a bit of money. The world won't fall over. We'll just have to do it next year. I mean, it's about figuring out not just risk, but what is the outcome of that risk.
Can I just add one thing? The use of the word inadequate, and we've done a lot of head scratching about what adjective to use there, but it does actually show a good degree of maturity that we're admitting that there's something that needs addressing. There's no sugarcoating of these risks, and it really shows that the executive is embracing them and putting them out there. So.
The other thing actually is without it, it's not an exercise in semantics, but that's one of the benefits of the deep dive. Is actually are we recognising the risk and its right characteristics? So I appreciate that. Thanks, Sean. Have you got any other questions? Because I think
I'll let some other people go.
Pardon? Yeah. Thanks, mate. Iona.
Look, thanks for your work. It's great to be here listening, what you've done. I think it's very important. Look, just for me, the question is whether we can group these in a bit more an organised way, because some of them have quite different impacts. Some are really, really profound. Some of them can be managed, like, for example, fraud. Yeah.
You're talking to an accountant here, Iona.
Yeah, so just that they're weighted appropriately, and I think, definitely some could be grouped, like, things that are hazards, natural or human-induced, and then you might have some internal organisational stuff. So they just do require and I would have I'm more like a picture person with, see, I'm not an accountant, with groupings of things which are, that are interrelated. And I always like to see connections between things. I think it always helps. And I guess that was the conversation I was having with Bruce and Stephen before this meeting. We have not, in my view, contrary to what my colleague will say, given enough weight to climate change as a key risk. And I want to make sure this time that we're, treating, and earthquakes as well, because, we're going to get a paper tomorrow which just is a reminder of how big our risk is, so that we just do give things appropriate weightings. Thank you, though.
Yeah, so I think that's and that's kind of the purpose of this reporting structure here. I know it's a little hard to see on a small laptop screen, apologies for that, but you'll be getting big chunky documents in future. There is ways of grouping around in terms of thinking about, do you want to frame conversations around some of the key impacts that this committee is really wanting to see, whether we're actually got work across the council in place to actually manage some of the impacts, which might be areas such as what are we actually doing for these threats that have a severe impact on, say, community well-being, or our environment, or looking down and saying, let's have a talk about, say, the climate change response one or the earthquake and tsunami one, and saying this is a pretty big consequence area. There's lots of things that actually relate to other physical impacts as well. So there's two ways you can think about it. Grouping them, there's no reason why you can't, but it's what value would add to the conversation, I think. How would that help? So there's different ways, I guess, to slice the pie. You can group them by the consequence areas that you're most interested in, if you want to have a conversation that way, or you can just group them, say, these are the natural hazard ones, these are the more human-influenced ones, these are the internal ones, financial ones.
Kim, I think that one of the questions was, what risks do you want to prioritise for conversation and audit and risk subcommittee? And you could say, hey, we really want to focus on the external risks first up, or you might say, let's have a mix of some internal, some external. But I think earlier on in the presentation, Kim kind of divided the risks into those that the organisation kind of has more direct impact on and those that are external to the organisation, such as climate change, such as, let's find another one, earthquake and tsunamis. So
that's right, because in the organisation to deal with internal fraud and cyber attacks. It's your expertise and you bring it in. But climate change, for example, is still something we're learning about, and we can't stop earthquakes. So yeah, that's just where the impact, the influence. Yeah.
If it helps, Liam behind me will be first up in terms of the chief officers coming to talk to the subcommittee in February. So.
I would like to just draw attention. Firstly, by the way, at the risk of running down my profession, I do agree a diagram is not a bad thing. And the other one that I find really helpful is the heat map, because while again it's a bit fuzzy on the presentation here, that has all our risks. And it would be natural that as a committee we have a focus on those which are of the highest risk. We need to keep our eye across all 13, undoubtedly. But it's logical, assuming that we are looking at what is the current state of these, that our eye is going to go to what are in that extreme top right box, because that's almost certain to happen, and it's extreme or severe in its consequence. We should be wanting to have assurance that whatever we can do to mitigate that is actually happening and that it is tracking. It's too small a diagram, but wherever is the relevant blue-grey dot that we are trying to get it to. Because, of course, that's the other question we have, and it comes back to Kim's point. There will be other things we can do. We might call them gaps. And so a question for us with these is actually, can we, should we, what will it cost to do it, what would be the benefit of doing it? So that's useful. So, yes, let's focus on the big ones, Iona. Let's use diagrams and not just the words or the dollar signs. Andy, I think you were next on the question line, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I think intuitively the two which are in that extreme top right-hand side are both related to essentially project delivery, cost, risk of project delivery, resources and so on, and that intuitively feels right. That's certainly where things are biting at the moment. So that's fine for me. In terms of things that I'm not sure are covered, but I'd be interested in your thinking around that. One is we sort of argued to and fro about whether consenting is in the risk area, and I'm particularly thinking building consents rather than resource consents. But there are definitely significant and realised financial liabilities for council. There have been for a decade plus, and the question then obviously is what do you do to try and avoid them in the future. So that's one I would sort of say is an ongoing, it's the business as usual kind of one, but it's real and it's expensive. I'm also just interested in whether there was any thought given to just general economic conditions. If something changes significantly economically, what implications that has for us. So, for example, at the moment we're starting to see interest rates move up. Obviously these are things we can anticipate, potentially respond to, but they do again have a material impact on the council. Maybe not in a huge catastrophic damaging way, but there's the sort of things that tick 1% or 2% onto your rates bill, and that's material. That's that kind of thing. Skill shortages are in there in a general sense. Is it picked up in a council sense? Our skills and technical capability, being able to get the people we need to be able to do some complicated projects.
Yeah, we've got that as one of the consequence areas. I know this diagram is really small. Apologies if it's hard to read, but
I'm sort of going.
Yeah. So the threat we've got in here is the resource and supply chain constraints, and that does include capability to recruit the expertise and source it from wherever, as well as material, goods and resources. But we also have a consequence category, so that's our staff capability and capacity, and that can be affected by a lot of these threats as well. So we have staff wellbeing, health and safety, and psychosocial health separate, but we have a category for our capability and capacity. So for any of these threats, we think, what does it mean? Would it actually affect our staff turnover rates and our ability to retain and attract staff?
Another one that's probably in the risk, I'm going to be slightly controversial with it, in the risk area actually is our own government that can make policy decisions. Sometimes you go, oh, didn't see that one coming, that was different. So legislation can be an interesting one in terms of having consequences.
We've got ability to adapt to major change, and that's large. That's one of the threats. So it's largely around legislative change, and it's actually more about whether we actually adapt well to the change as a threat, rather than that it just comes out of the blue. But that could be reworded. I mean, that's...
No, I'm just saying that clearly is something that has changed at quite a number of things. And look, the other thing I'm just interested in is okay, we've got all these, it's the what we do with them. It's the key thing is, so what, we've got a whole lot of risks there, is what do we do about those risks, and what are the moves we can make, and what are the costs of making those moves? Because sometimes, in fact, it's cost you more to mitigate the risk. You know, for example, the way you share risk in a contract might cost you more than it's worth. But other times there are things you can do which are worth doing, but at least you've got to give consideration to them. So I guess that's the bit that for me is fundamentally interesting about looking at risk, is thinking about the opportunities to do something about them.
And Andy, that's the value of the 13 profile snapshots. I'm sorry, I'm not sitting with what I'm.
Yeah, I didn't see if you go to one of those other.
If you go to the next page on the presentation, that's the value of that, Andy. Is that at the meeting, we will deal with these on at relevant times. Yeah. But this really is a detailed description of actually what we are doing to mitigate the risk. I think 4 is a really good one. What could we do? Which would really come to your question about actually what's the value of doing that? How could we do it?
I wonder if that was the current and future risk management. Anyway, that's the key.
But this becomes the key driver for us to assess it. The other thing which is really important, and perhaps I've made a mistake in not showing you the total work program, but I want to reflect also, this is the importance for us at this committee of having Richard and internal assurance being received over many of these areas as well, because it's not only have we identified the risk, but actually we need to get the hands-on evidence that actually some of the controls around these are actually implemented and working, and that's where the internal audit program becomes really important to us, that we have it driven with that. Sarah's got first, and then we'll.
I'm still struggling with the mapping. So does each one of those 13 map to just one of these? Just one, okay. Okay, each just has one, okay. And the other thing, I guess, is, sorry, I had to duck out of the room. The materiality of some of them seem more significant than others. So I think that's what Iona might have raised about, can we prioritise the really big worrying things? And do we even know what they are? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Sarah, possibly in the other room, was it?
Yeah.
Somebody raised fraud.
Someone did raise
fraud, and we might want to. I have to say, as chairing a risk committee in a public sector organisation, I'm always worried about fraud. It is a sleeper. You know, when you're a Otago DHB and somebody walks out the door with $17 million, you suddenly realise what fraud really is. I think the first thing I would say is you're quite right, Iona's quite right. Some of these are more equal than others. Okay, there isn't that, if you go to the heat map as you've seen here, Andy, I think you've pulled it out. The ones to the right and to the top should worry us the most, and we should be focusing most on those because they are the biggest threat to the organisation achieving its objectives. I don't know which one of those is fraud, but I suspect in the controlled targeted range, it's actually pretty low.
Can I ask another question? And that's, how do we know we've scanned across every risk? You know, if we're just going to have these 13, how are we assured?
Well, there are lots of other risks, actually.
Yeah.
There are many other risks.
Well, I'm just thinking of a big one we're sitting on.
It's like a pyramid, Sarah. That's why when it comes to our risk management, we want the group risk managers to present to us, because we're asking them to talk about their entire portfolio, not just whatever might be relevant.
But I'm backing up the truck to ask if we've even got the right 13 and if we've got them all, and what process...
Yeah.
What assurance can we have that you've scanned across everything? You know, I'm thinking
that's part of why they're asking the question today about we think that they've got everything.
Well, I think Sean raised a really good point. One is, what about our risk of being sued? You know, like, we're sitting on a potential risk of quite a few million in terms of being sued about buildings that have failed. Where does that fit in?
I can answer.
Yeah.
Andy has raised so it depends how you tackle on what is the lens. Is it the risk of being sued, or is it the risk we make a poor consenting decision, which I think is the point that Andy's made. The consequence of making a poor decision is the risk of being sued down the track.
Sometimes things change.
Yeah. And I need to, it's interesting, Fleur. I need to point out that, again, going back to what Stephen said, in terms of our program, we will have quarterly updates on our litigation risk.
So is that in one of the 13? Can we just go?
No. Sorry, that's a separate item in our work program. Which
Can we go to the work program slide?
Sorry, Tim's got a question here first, and then we'll go to yours, Jenny. Okay.
Can we go back to that slide that it was just on before, like it just swapped? Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm not comfortable with this big table.
Oh, well, I mean, I am. I just wanted to point something out. So, you know how you've got these criteria down the left? I think it would be cool.
Yes.
I think it would be good to have like something about equity in here, because I was just thinking when Sean was talking about the climate adaptation stuff, or, you know, whatever you call it, you know, how do you kind of measure what that looks like, and then acknowledging that some communities have more resource to bounce back and more resilience than others. And so I think, like, in this list down the side here, one of these things could be, measurements could be like around equity, specifically around like more resource constrained communities being able to bounce back from some of these things, and then that kind of channels our responses throughout the organisation to make sure that they're well resourced to be able to bounce back from any of these things, like earthquakes. You know, like communities in Strathmore and Tawa are not going to be able to bounce back as fast as like Mount Vic or.
Tim, I think it would be generally covered under the community wellbeing.
I was thinking that too, but community wellbeing can focus on like those well resourced, loud communities that.
Yeah, we haven't got much time, so I'll just quickly point out, in this little table that says number 1, here's where we've got a bit of commentary and rationale around why we're rating things, and I think that's the opportunity where you can say, we think this impact will be severe because we have such a diversity of communities, or we think this is more likely to affect our disadvantaged or specific populations, so you can put some flavour around why the assessment gets that rating and talk about specific communities, or we know this is going to hit this area hardest, and that's where you can put that rating and to say, and the community score is high because of this particular outcome. It's the equity thing is it will be a driver of how severe the consequences are overall, but this is looking at the consequences to the city and to our council and our ability to achieve our objectives. So I think that's where it would work the best, but I'm happy to have that kind of conversation if there's another way I can fit it in there. But I think it's more of a driver of vulnerability and how severe the consequences will be. Yeah.
One of the things I want to stress about a risk committee, which is good, and I'm already glad, I'm encouraged by the conversation knowing that we've got to end here, is I've appreciated all the different lenses. The point is we're not meant to be uniform and standard in our approach to risk. We're meant to bring out different perspectives. So if it's a climate change perspective, it's an equity perspective, if it's a decision-making perspective, that's cool, because they are all needed be able to have a discussion around risk and to be able to have, for us to have confidence that it's managed well, and also to be able to give our rest of our colleagues that confidence. So that's really good. So that's the sort of discussion that I find actually very encouraging. It'll be a challenge to manage you lot. When we, but
that's probably your biggest risk, to be honest.
I'm more than that's okay. Yeah.
I just had a few that just things that have come to me and I've raised in the past. But one of the big ones I think that we need to be really mindful of is government leaving Wellington. Leaving Wellington, yeah. So also around the retail failing or significant reductions in retail given their place in our rating base. I'm also really worried about the risk of low voter turnout and what that means for our legitimacy and our ability to be able to make decisions for Wellington. And the other one I'm a bit worried about is the ability of mana whenua to meet the huge demands that we're constantly placing on them. So if we, and I certainly do, think that that is critical to our ability to make good decisions for Wellington, then we need to make sure that they, or help them or engage with them or work out how to allow that conversation and engagement and involvement to happen in the most meaningful way.
Thank you. That again, I come back to the point that this is going to encourages me that we'll have some very rich discussions. I forget which is the first meeting date, but it's somewhere. 2nd of February. 2nd of February. There we go. So if you can retain that sort of rip-roaring energy, that would be great. But I do hope you get Christmas before then. So I think we're at the point where we do need to conclude. I see other folk are in here. So thank you for your time. I hope that gives you a sense of direction of travel for us in the committee. And as I say, encourages you to be there on the 2nd of February. Thank you.